stick around. We can sit and have a little more of a conversation. What I want to talk about this morning is not climate change. I don't want to talk about deep political divisions that have become so much a part of American life. I don't want to talk about America's growing isolation on the world stage. I'm not going to talk about the rise of anti-Semitism. I'm not going to talk about crime, inflation, or any of the other uncertainties that surround us, because that would just instill in us a sense of fear of our surroundings. I'm not going to talk about them because, truthfully, we already know they exist. And you didn't come to shul on Shabbos morning to hear about all the things that are going to take over our world or the things that ought to frighten us. We don't need a reminder of everything that can make us anxious. We are surrounded by enough voices telling us what we ought to be afraid of. And we don't come to shul in order to get ourselves even more angry than we already are. The question I want to explore today is not whether there are reasons to be afraid. There always have been. There probably always will be. The question is, what does fear do to us? How does fear shape the way we see the world? And how do we prevent fear from becoming the lens through which we understand our own lives? This is the great lesson of Parshat Devarim and the story of the spies as it's retold in this morning's Torah reading. As Moses prepares the Israelites to enter the promised land, he looks back at one of the defining failures, not the only defining failure of the wilderness experience, but one of the defining experiences of the wilderness generation. The Israelites had experienced God's miracles. They had witnessed the plagues in Egypt. They crossed the Sea of Reeds. They received the Torah at Mount Sinai. They saw that they weren't abandoned through the gift of manna. And yet they stood at the edge of the promised land and they became afraid. They refused to go up into the land of Israel as God had commanded them. What's striking is that Moses does not say they lacked information. They knew exactly what to expect there. They knew the land was good. They knew God had promised it to them. They knew that they had survived everything in their path towards the edge of the promised land. The problem wasn't a lack of knowledge. The problem was fear. Fear became so powerful, it distorted their understanding of reality. They said, "V'targeru b'Elohehem v'tomru b'sinat Adonai otanu." Is it possible that God hates us? And so they went back to their tents and they sulked. They were afraid of what was going to happen. Would they be wiped out when they entered the promised land? Can you imagine their thought process? Think about how remarkable that statement is. The same people who had watched God split the sea now convinced themselves that God had rescued them only to destroy them. Fear had rewritten the story. The God who had saved them became, in their minds, the God who wanted to harm them. The future that could have been filled with promise became a future defined only by danger. That is the power of fear. Fear doesn't simply make us nervous. Fear changes the way we interpret reality. Fear causes us to look at the possibilities and see only the threats. Fear causes us to focus on what we might lose rather than what we might gain. Fear convinces us that the worst possible outcome is not only possible, but the worst possible outcome is inevitable. And perhaps the reason fear is so powerful is because human beings have extraordinary imaginations. We are among the few creatures that walk this earth capable of imagining a future that is both one of God's greatest gifts to humanity and one of our Achilles' heels. Because that imagination can work in two different directions. Our imaginations allow us to create art, to build communities, to solve problems, to envision a better world. But our imaginations can also create scenarios that have never happened and may never happen. Our minds are remarkably talented at imagining the worst-case scenario. We can imagine the conversations that will go badly. We can imagine the diagnosis we hope never comes. We can imagine the failure before we even try. We can imagine the conflict before we even have a conversation. But if our minds are capable of imagining the worst-case scenario, then we should also be able to cultivate the best-case scenario. What if the conversation goes better than we had expected? What if the challenge becomes an opportunity? What if the future contains blessings we cannot yet see? Faith is not pretending that difficulties don't exist. Faith is refusing to believe that difficulties are the only possibility. There's a Hasidic master who I often quote, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Leib Alter, also known as the Sfat Emet. He offers this beautiful insight into the sin of the spies. The Sfat Emet writes, Hamaraglim lo chatu b'ma shera'u et hakoshi. Spies didn't see sin because they saw the difficulty. Ela b'ma shenirdefu min hashoresh hapnimi shel ha'emunah. But they sinned because they disconnected themselves from the inner root of faith. Their sin wasn't that they saw challenges. It was that they had no faith in their ability to overcome them. The Sfat Emet understands that the problem was not the spies' recognized challenges. There always are challenges. There were real challenges. There were giants who inhabited the land. The inhabitants of the land were powerful. The journey wasn't going to be easy, no doubt. The mistake was allowing what they saw on the outside to erase what they knew about themselves on the inside. They saw giants, but forgot God. They saw obstacles and forgot their own strength. They saw uncertainty and forgot the miracles that had brought them so far. This is an important lesson for all of us. Faith doesn't mean denying reality. Judaism doesn't ask us to ignore the problems around us. Rather, faith asks us to see a full reality. The spies only saw part of the truth. They saw the difficulty, but they failed to see the possibilities. The challenge for every generation is the same, and it also is for ourselves individually. Will we allow fear to tell us the whole story? Fear will always have a voice. It will always point out what can go wrong. I promise you, don't worry that you'll forget it. Sometimes it even serves a useful purpose by protecting us from danger. But fear cannot be our only voice. To be sure, there is doubt. We're afraid. Anti-Semitism is on the rise, and it's a reality we have to confront. Yet this challenge can't be the entire story of the American Jewish experience. To define ourselves only by the threats we face is to miss the beauty, the resilience, and the joy that can remain constant and central in our lives. The Israelites were standing at the entrance to the promised land. The greatest tragedy was not that the land was difficult. The tragedy was that the fear prevented them from discovering what was possible. Each of us stands at our own borders, moments of transition, uncertainty, and change. Just one example. How many of you have put off going to the doctor when you knew something was wrong? We face decisions about our families, our communities, our health, our relationships, our future. We face decisions all the time. In those moments, we have a choice. We cannot allow fear to be our only reality. Or as we can remember that the same God who carried us through yesterday is present and will enter tomorrow. Parshat Devarim teaches us that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the decision that fear will not have the final word. May we all have the wisdom to acknowledge our fears, but the faith to imagine beyond. May we all cultivate not only an imagination for what can go wrong, but an imagination for what can go right. And may we always remember that the future is not only something we enter, it's something we help create. Shabbat Shalom. Ooh, did that feel good? We begin with Chatzi Kaddish for the Musaf service on page